My name is Jamal Thomas. This is Jamal Thomas Show. I hope you guys can hear me all right and everything is good. I have the luxury, the pleasure, the honor of being joined with Professor Mohammed Marandi. He is a professor of English literature and Orientalism at the University of Tehran. Professor, how are you doing?
I'm doing very well, thank you.
I really appreciate you joining me. I have been looking forward to this conversation, and I've always been appreciative of your take and your point of view. So, there have been conflicting narratives about the, let's say, severity, about the success or less than success of the Israeli attack on on Iran that took place over the weekend. They are saying they used 100 planes. They are saying they attacked military installations, that they hit S-300 missile systems. Now, the videos that came out showed air defense of Iran engaging many of the projectile that was coming into the capital. But Iran is downplaying the significance of this attack, whereas Israel is inflating the significance of the attack. From the Iranian point of view, what is the significance of this attack? How is it as elaborate as Israelis are saying and as successful as Israelis are saying? What actually took place over the weekend?
Well, it was a heavy strike. It was supposed to be a heavy strike at least, and the Israelis wanted to cause a lot of damage. But I think that they were a bit surprised, or probably very surprised, uh, by Iran's elaborate air defense systems. And I should add that Iran did not use most of its air defense systems because the Iranians believe that the Americans want to gain information about Iran's capabilities. So Iran continues to hide whatever capabilities that it has that are unnecessary for the situation. I think anyone who looks at the footage of the Iranian strikes on the Israeli regime and compares them to, well, it's basically a non-event in Iran, they'll see that the Iranian strikes were obviously much more uh, severe and much more effective. Um, the Iranians, I should point out, they do not have many targets on the ground that are of great significance. All of Iran's strategic assets have been moved underground over the last 2, 3 decades because the Americans have made many threats against Iran, both Iran's nuclear program, but also Iran's defense capabilities. So the Iranians over the last 2, 3 decades have been moving uh, the assets to underground uh, place bases and installations to protect them against American airstrikes. And obviously, the Israeli regime does not have the capabilities that the Americans have. So there is nothing of great importance that they could strike on the ground because all of those things that are of great importance are underground. And Iran's military industry is spread out. In other words, there are no major factories. They're all small workshops that are spread out, basically to make sure that they're well protected. And again, that is not because of the Israeli regime, that's because of the threats that were made by the United States. So if the regime tries to strike Iranian missile production sites or tries to strike the Iranian nuclear program, they can cause some damage, but they cannot cause real damage. They cannot cause significant damage. Alongside that, one of the key areas where they attacked is right beside Tehran. And actually, it's not very far from where I live. If there were serious explosions, we would have seen them in Tehran because it was at night and because that area is somewhat flat and Tehran is a slope city. It goes into the mountains. And from the north and near the mountains, you can see pretty clearly if there's an explosion there, especially at night. You'd see the light, you see the fire. And there was no such thing. And as you know, everyone has cell phones nowadays. Everyone has a camera. So it's not something that anyone can hide anymore. And also, I guess something that would be meaningful to a Western audience is that the markets also indicate that nothing happened because before the strike, remember the Israelis were saying that the Iranians won't know what hit them. When they say that, you're expecting like something really massive. And then what happened was that actually people didn't know what hit them because many people were asleep, and in the morning they woke up and they were told that there was an attack, and they didn't even wake up because nothing happened. So it wasn't they didn't know what hit them, not for the reason that the Israelis were implying, but because it didn't seem all that significant. But most importantly, the markets after the strike went up, and the Iranian currency strengthened. And I think that indicates that the markets really weren't impressed with the Israeli strike.
Now, Axios is reporting that before the strike, Israel contacted Iran, basically giving them a heads up and issuing a threat that, hey, we're going to do this strike, but we don't want you to respond after the strike. Is that true, or is that something that was introduced after the fact in order to cover for the attack being somewhat underwhelming? What's the reality here?
Axios is probably the most propagandistic outlet in the United States when it comes to Israel. So I don't really take anything that Axios says seriously. There's no doubt that the Iranians are going to strike back. The Iranians are going to retaliate. There's no doubt about it. Even if they fired one missile and that missile hit a barn, the Iranians would retaliate because they said they would. And so um, we heard the leader say that Iran is going to show its strength to the Israeli regime. Why? Because the Israelis have to learn the hard way that they cannot strike Iran. If Iran refrains from punishing the regime, that will only encourage them to do it again. Uh, Remember, we are speaking about people who are carrying out a Holocaust. They're slaughtering women and children day and night. If they're not sane people like you and me, Netanyahu has to be smacked down. And since the Americans won't yank hard on his leash, the Iranians have no option but to do it themselves. So, regardless of whether it's an ineffective strike or not, the Iranians were going to retaliate. And I think that if the Israelis had any other expectations, that would just show that they know very little about Iran.
But Professor, so I read the Ayatollah's comments. They didn't come across as if they were committal. In fact, many of the comments that were coming out, for example, Przeshian, he pointed out we're not looking for war. He said we will respond appropriately. He said we do not seek war, but we will defend the rights of our nation and country. He told the cabinet meeting on Sunday we will give an appropriate response to aggression to the Zionist regime. The Ayatollah, he comes out and says, right, effectively, he gives also somewhat of a non-committal statement. He says the Zionist regime 2 nights ago should neither be downplayed nor exaggerated. He said Iran power should be demonstrated to Israel, adding, quote, it is to the authorities to determine how to convey the power and the will of the Iranian people to the Israeli regime and to take action and to serve the interests of the nation and the country. All right. I have no idea what that means. And it doesn't necessarily sound like it's we will attack, we will strike back. So what's the reality of this? Is the plan to retaliate, or is the plan to find an off-ramp to escalation?
No, I think the intention is to definitely retaliate. But what he is saying is that political and military leaders have to sit down together and decide what exactly Iran should do, because there are different scenarios. They can use different numbers of missiles or missiles and drones. They could strike different types of targets. There are different ways to deal with this. So they have to sit down and assess what would be the most appropriate way to punish the Israelis that would be also relevant to the act of aggression that the Israeli regime carried out. So I personally think that probably that would mean, for example, the Iranians will strike military targets. I may be wrong. They may strike economic centers as well. But perhaps, and I'm just speculating, that since the regime bombed, uh, they claim to have bombed military sites, then Iran may respond by bombing military sites.
What do you say to people who point out that up to this point, Iran has done everything it can? Basically, they're pragmatic to avoid a war. And in trying to avoid a war, by downplaying this strike, they can effectively say, okay, well, you didn't hit us. Yes, you killed several people, but it wasn't necessarily this massive strike that you said it. And because of such, we would prefer to deal with the economic concerns, the economic matters, and we will try to find another way to strike back. For example, even in his statement, he said, should be demonstrated to Israel. The authorities are to determine how to convey that power and will. And so he wasn't saying this in the context that there will be a strike. He was saying that I'm going to devolve the authority to figure out how they should respond. But is there a way of responding to this non-militarily that he may be thinking about?
I don't think that's what he meant. I think that he was basically saying that there will be a retaliation, but the size and the magnitude of the retaliation is something that Iranian senior leaders and military officials should sit down and discuss together and decide. That's how I read it. I don't see it any other way. And I also think the logic behind it is that, first of all, the regime killed four officers, and also one civilian was killed as well. But secondly, as I said earlier, the Israelis are not they're not ordinary people. They're not like you and me. They would interpret any inaction on behalf of Iran as a sign of weakness, and they will again strike. They will do it again. And so, therefore, the only way to make sure that the regime doesn't attack again is to make them pay a heavy price. And it is possible that after Iran strikes, the Israeli regime will strike again. But I have no doubt that Iran will strike again after that. Iran can easily outgun the Israelis. The only question is what happens next? Do the Americans get involved? That would, I think, lead to a regional war and the destruction of the global economy, because the oil and gas that comes from the Persian Gulf region would no longer be available to markets. Not for a day, not for a week, not for a month, but I think permanently.
So one of the things that, or the ideas that has been floating around in trying to interpret the statements that have been coming out of Iran's leadership is that Iran may be considering working towards a nuclear weapon. And this has been something that several people, I mean, granted, these are American analysts, not necessarily on, let's say, CNN, but American analysts that are on the web, some military people, as they read a statement about feel Iran's power, they associate that with, okay, well, is Iran now going to try to get a nuclear weapon in order to compete, considering it's up against two nuclear powers, Israel and the United States? What is your thought on that? Is there any truth, reality associated with that at all?
Iran has, till now, never attempted to build a nuclear weapon. If Iran wanted a nuclear weapon, it would have had it 10, 15 years ago. Iran has had that capability for a very long time. And if Iran wanted a nuclear weapon now, it could build one probably within days. Iran is technologically very advanced. Its nuclear industry is probably one of the 10 to 12 top or most advanced nuclear industries in the world. And of course, Iran's missile defense capabilities are well known. But that has never been the Iranian objective. And the Iranians have said, the advisor to the leader, the former foreign minister under President Khatami, twice, that if there's an existential threat, if Iran's nuclear program is threatened, or if Iran is threatened by a nuclear weapon, then Iran's nuclear posture would change.
But
if Iran's nuclear program is not a threat, or if Iran is not threatened by some sort of nuclear device or attack, if this is not the case, then there's no reason for Iran to change direction. But if there's an existential threat to Iran's national security, then I think everything changes.
but currently, that is not on the table so far. Meaning, they don't consider the threat of Israel to be existential in the way that it's currently unfolding. Right now, it's just considered this is a tit for tat that has the potential to escalate, but hasn't necessarily reached that stage where it's escalated to the point where it threatens the state, or for that matter, where Iran feels in any way, let's say, insecure by what has taken place up to this point.
You're correct, but remember, this is an insane regime that we're dealing with. This is a regime that's carrying out a Holocaust as we speak, and the West allows it to do so. So it's not as if the Iranians think that it's impossible. The regime in Tel Aviv has no morality whatsoever. It's racist. They consider themselves to be the chosen people. The rest of us are subhuman. So people who have that sort of worldview are always going to be very dangerous. So I think Iran will always keep a close eye on the behavior of Tel Aviv, and of course the behavior of Western countries, because so far, no matter what sort of slaughter the regime has carried out, the West has always been fine with it. They may have nag about it now and then, but they're still highly supportive. So I think that you're right, that at the moment we're not moving in that direction, but we're not dealing with normal people in Tel Aviv.
Is there concern in Iran that the objective of Israel is to eliminate resistance forces first before turning its attention to Iran? Basically, if it's going after Iran now, it is effectively going after Hamas, Hezbollah, the Houthis are also attacking, and Iran, meaning it is an overwhelming force. So their plan has been, we're going to exterminate, or for that matter, go after the resistance forces first. We're going to marginalize those forces, then move into Iran. Is there any consideration associated with that at all? Meaning, is that part of the thinking that is taking place currently within Iran?
No, the Israelis have lost on all fronts. They have not been able to even take Gaza. They've just lost 4 soldiers hours ago in Gaza. And this is after over a year of genocide. Remember, in the day, the Israelis were able to, when they attacked Egypt, go all the way to the Suez Canal. Now, after well over a year and all this genocide, they haven't been able to take this little dot on the map. And even more impressive is how Hezbollah has defeated the regime. After a month of trying to invade Lebanon and take southern Lebanon for itself and create some sort of buffer zone, the regime has been unable to take a single village. And then, of course, we have Ansarullah in Yemen. The Americans have been bombing it, but just hours ago, we saw 3 more ships that were violating the sanctions against Israel, struck by Ansarullah. So I don't think, if that is the Israeli objective, it's not going according to plan.
From your point of view, how does How does this resolve, or do you consider it resolving? I mean, let me expand on this question a little bit. It seems that what Israel wants is to effectively create greater Israel, and in doing so, to eliminate or exterminate the Palestinians that are in the north, the Lebanese that is in southern Lebanon, and even to basically steal parts of Syria. They're occupying parts of Syria right now. Do you, when this has to end at some point, meaning there has to be some level of resolution, even if the resolution is somewhat of a lull, I don't see us going back to something before, to a standard in regards to like October 6th, meaning before October 7th, where there's this open air ghetto, apartheid state, etc., with Israel making associations with the various Arab states that in the region. If it is not going back to that, then what do you consider it going to? Meaning, how does this ultimately, if you had to put a prediction on it, what do you think this looks like when it resolves?
I don't think that the Zionist project will last. I think the Israeli regime has gone too far. It has exposed itself to the world as an apartheid, a brutal, racist apartheid and genocidal regime. And this is not going to end well for them. The regime has, in the past been seen by many across the world as just some ordinary regime. People who don't know what's going on in Palestine. They never showed much interest. But now people are watching the regime devastate the Palestinian people, massacre day and night, and they've opened their eyes to the reality of the regime. So in future, no one is going to look at Israelis favorably. If an Israeli travels to China, people look down upon that person. Whenever they travel to anywhere in the world, people are going to look down upon people who hold Israeli passports. So Israel is.
I might have lost him for a bit. Hopefully, we can get him back on. Let's see what's going on. Oh, your mic is muted. Professor, if you can hear me, your mic is muted.
Ultimately, when there is a ceasefire, because Hamas will still be there, Hezbollah will still be there, the resistance will still be there, that means Israel has lost. That will be a historic defeat, and I don't think it will ever recover from that. So for the region, the only acceptable solution is the end to an ethno-supremacist regime. And extraordinarily, that is something that for the Americans and the Europeans is unacceptable. In other words, the West, which has always claimed to be supportive of human rights, is insistent that a regime that believes in racial hierarchy must remain in place. This is not going to work. The region, we've gone beyond, the region has changed. And no one is going to go back to the past and accept this genocidal regime to stay put.
Have you been surprised at the level at which the Arab states have been willing to accept this level of chaos? I mean, for God's sake, Israel has murdered from 40,000 to 100,000 people, 2/3 of which are women and children. That's just in Gaza. And then they've expanded that into Lebanon, where they've killed thousands. It seems like I've never seen a situation where the military explicitly, almost gleefully, goes after the civilian population. And what's been shocking to me is that the Arab states have fundamentally just stayed there and watched while this is taking place without necessarily getting involved, short of shaking their fist here and there. Does that surprise you at this willingness that they've been willing to accept what Israel has been doing without any kind of intervention.
No, not at all. These Arab regimes are dictatorships that are bound to the West. They're only in place because the West helps them stay in power by suppressing the population, by imposing uh, strict dictatorial rule. The only thing that somewhat surprises me is Turkey, and that how Erdogan, the Turkish president, has done up almost nothing for the Palestinian people. He continues to allow trade to take place indirectly now uh, through Greece. But more importantly, he facilitates Baku oil, cheap oil to go to Israel through Turkish ports. That I find quite stunning. And his betrayal of the Palestinian people, I find to be really impossible to comprehend. He was so willing to destroy Syria and spend so many tens, if not hundreds of billions of dollars of his own money and the money of other governments to destroy Syria, but he's not willing to give the people of Palestine a single bullet, nor is he willing to impose an embargo on the Israeli regime. I find that to be very difficult to comprehend. But when it comes to the Arab regimes, no, I think that they are definitely not representative of their own people, and that they are fully bound to the United States, and they will remain fully bound to the United States in the future.
Saudi Arabia offered Iran to join it for military drills. If I'm not mistaken, it was Saudi Arabia, Egypt offered it for the first time for Iran to join. I guess the reason why I'm asking the question, it seems like they're trying to communicate something in doing so, since that's the first time they've ever done it. And I know BRICS has brought these countries together, Saudi Arabia, Iran, etc. But I get this sense that they are trying to either do this for public consumption, basically, no, really, we're against Israel. See, we're working with Iran in the context of this to communicate that we are together as Muslims on this issue. Is it for purely internal communication, political communication, or is there a larger reality to what they're trying to communicate to the external world, specifically to Israel, or for that matter, the United States?
I think it probably is a bit of both. I'm sure that the Saudis recognize how angry people are and that it's only Iran and the resistance that are uh, pushing back against the Israeli regime. And they want to be seen as not completely in the US camp. But also, I think the Saudis do want to hedge their bets a bit. I don't think they have the will and capability to do a great deal because they are very much the regime is very much bound to the United States. But I think they are trying to develop better ties with Russia, with China, and with Iran, among others, in order to, as I said, hedge their bets a bit. Iran's policy is to improve ties with Saudi Arabia and other countries, other neighboring countries. So Iran will, push the Saudis to make sure, and other countries in the Persian Gulf to make sure that the United States is to make sure that the United States does not try to get involved in this war. Because if the United States does get involved, that would mean the end of all of these regimes. They are all very deeply, they're all reliant on oil sales, and Iran will destroy their oil and gas assets because of American bases in uh, in these countries. So if the Americans attack, these countries will be hostile. So the Iranians are trying to cultivate good friendship relations and to have them push the Americans to stay out of this, because we don't want war. But if the Americans get involved, then it's an existential struggle. And so the oil and gas assets in the Persian Gulf will all be destroyed. And these regimes will no longer exist. These are small family regimes. They're, Kuwait, Qatar, the Emirates. they're not significant. And even Saudi Arabia, we saw how Ansar Allah, the Houthis, defeated them, despite the fact that they were using their oil wealth and the fact that they had the entire West working with them in their genocidal war on Yemen. So these are all weak and vulnerable regimes, and Iran wants to have good relations with them, but also to make sure that they recognize that if the Americans get involved in a fight with Iran, since they have bases in these countries will not be able to escape Iran's wrath. So hopefully they'll listen, and hopefully Americans will listen to them, and we won't have what is, I think, something that would be catastrophic for the world, and that is a regional war.
Last two questions. From your point of view, there's been this conversation that has been floating around about whether or not what is taking place in the Middle East, excuse me, is the tail wagging the dog or the dog wagging the tail. From the Iranian point of view, when it's looking out at everything that's been taking place, the attacks in Gaza, the attacks in Lebanon, the attack on Iran, the attacks in Syria, are they looking at this as the tail wagging the dog or the dog wagging the tail? Which one does Iran consider it to be?
As a powerful force in the United States and in Palestine. Zionism is what has pushed Americans towards war with Iraq. Zionism does not care about the interests of the American people or the United States. It cares about the interests of Zionists. And so the catastrophic foreign policy of the United States that we've seen over the last few decades is because of the Zionist lobby. And therefore, the real power is in the United States, but it's not the United States or Israel. It's Zionism that has a hold on the United States and to a large degree determines government policy and therefore the behavior of the United States towards the Israeli regime. The Israeli regime is a small and weak and vulnerable regime. And if the Americans stop sending weapons and ammunition and providing political support, the war in Gaza would be over within hours. The regime would just simply have to stop. So the power is in the United States, but the real force that makes these decisions in the United States, they are Zionists. And Zionists are Christians.
Well, yeah, and I guess that's why, yeah, and I guess that's why the question becomes somewhat interesting. Because there's this question going on, they may be grumbling behind the scenes, but all things being equal, there was contradictory reporting with some people saying that the Biden administration was okay with them going into Lebanon, going after Hezbollah. And in other cases, not so much. So it's been very contradictory. I guess my point of view is if they didn't want it to happen, it wouldn't be happening. To your point, you're right. If they stop the weapons, then everything stops. There was a report that came out that said 70%, 70 of what of Israel's war making that has taken place over the last year has come from the United States, meaning our tax dollars has paid for 70% of this killing and that has been done effectively in our name. It is outrageous. But you're absolutely right. Last question. The security partnership with Russia. So this was something that had been talked about. From my understanding, it was something that they wanted to get signed or get done at the BRICS conference in Kazan, but it wasn't necessarily prepared yet. And there was a question about whether or not the reason it wasn't completed was because there was concern that if Israel actually did launch, and if that launch was significant, that it would end up creating a war that would drag Russia into it immediately, considering Russia's already in a fight with Ukraine. What's the reality of that? Is the security partnership still on the menu or still on the list to be done? And if so, is there any thoughts, A, about what's going to be in it, and B, when any notion of when it's going to be completed?
No, it doesn't have anything to do with what's going on in the region right now. During the BRICS conference, it wasn't a priority to have this signed because it is important. It is very important for the in the bilateral relationship. But BRICS is not about the bilateral relationship. It's about something much broader. And therefore, the focus of Iran and Russia was to strengthen BRICS because Iran and Russia have uh, pinned a lot of hope on BRICS because these two countries are heavily sanctioned. So I think during the BRICS conference, it wouldn't be a priority to mix these two. These are two separate things. I think that ultimately there will be a separate meeting where it is signed. As far as I know, the text is about ready, but there has to be an opportunity for the two sides to meet and have a signing ceremony.
Is there any, and I know I'm pushing on this, is there any idea of what's going to be in that text? Meaning, how close is this relationship going to be when that text is finally written and the text finally come out? Has there been any reporting in Iran on it at all? I mean, I got to be honest, I'm super curious about what that relationship is going to look like.
No, there's no information about the text that's been made to the public. But we have to keep in mind that the Iranian-Russian relationship has evolved tremendously ever since the war in Ukraine began and sanctions were imposed on Russia. And Iran was sympathetic to the Russian side because Iran believed that NATO was the main, they bore the bulk of responsibility for the war, for provoking Russia. So over the last 2.5 to roughly 2.5 years, a bit more than 2.5 years now, the two sides have grown much closer. And I think that this agreement is meaningful in that context. It will further bring the countries closer to each other. But in general, the two sides have moved very close to each other. This is a very different relationship than what we had 3-4 years ago, and definitely very different from 10, 15, 20 years ago.
Professor Mann, I deeply appreciate this conversation. Professor Saeed Mohammed Marandi. He is Professor of English Literature and Orientalism at the University of Tehran. Thank you for this. Thank you for joining me. All right, guys. I am going to end this here. I hope you guys are well informed in regards to this conversation. I know I am. I know I deeply appreciate it. And I'm going to say like, I'm going to say share, and I am going to say subscribe. You guys have a fantastic day. Signing off.